Hello, Andrea with the Bangs here, and on today's talk, I have the privilege of speaking with the bearded Englishman of Rebel Wisdom, David Fuller. We were able to speak about the topic of the IDW, and I was really excited to be able to speak with David because he's hosted pretty much most of the prominent members of the IDW on his channel. So we were able to discuss where the IDW came from, what early versions of it looked like, directions it could have gone in, directions it actually did go in. We speak about those prominent members of the IDW. We talk a little bit about Dave Rubin, about Joe Rogan, two very different platforms that hosted these early IDW talks and the different directions that they've gone in. And we both appreciate what it has started and would love to see it, improve. And critiques in good faith often help us to improve. We also discuss what is the definition of, say, a bad faith actor. What is that even? What is that? Is it someone who just disagrees with you? Or is it someone who is coming at you with a really malicious intent? That's not super clear. So yeah, we have a really good discussion on the IDW and what it meant and means for our society. And we talk about Rebel Wisdom and what they're trying to do in their space that they sort of occupy. And I really like this one, guys, and I am looking forward to hearing your perspective and your questions or comments on it. Let me know what you think, and if you haven't subscribed, please remember to as soon as you can. Whatever, let's get started. Okay, hello, David.
Hey, good to see you.
Officially starting. Good to see you. So I have asked you here today to discuss the infamous IDW, or intellectual dark web, for those of you who don't know the lingo.
Yeah, those who aren't across all of the TLAs.
I know, you should just know though, come on, if you're watching this, you should be in that world. Just kidding, I want to have people from all walks of life who watch this.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of have been around.
So do you want to do a little introduction to what the IDW is first?
Do you want me to do it, or do you? What would you prefer?
Go on, you
do it. Okay, I'll host since I'm hosting. So okay, the intellectual dark web is, well, there's two. Okay, I've heard of two versions, which is what I wanted to talk to you about. First, what most people think of it as is a group of academics who came together around 2017 or 2018, would you say?
I think early 2018 it was sort of first named and crystallized.
Okay, in early 2018, and it's these academics sort of espousing particular ways of doing discourse and free thinking, freedom of speech, amongst other things, that kind of an idea. And then I've also heard it described more as a way to do discourse, a way to have an open mind, a way to discuss ideas. That part didn't catch on, that one. But I think it's the better of the two, rather than attaching it to people, because people fail, right? Yeah. Whereas a way of doing discourse can, last. So, okay, so that's my little intro. So, take it away.
Yeah, no, I think it is a genuinely interesting question. We could probably talk for about 20 minutes or half an hour just about these definitions, because there are many different definitions of what the IDW is. I think already I'm hearing some people's voices in my head kind of disagreeing, saying that it's mostly academics, I think would raise the hackles of quite a lot of the IDW's critics, because a lot of it is, I'd say it's more, the center of gravity for me is more in the podcast space. You've got sort of the Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Sam Harris, who built up a big following online.
Right.
And then you have people like Eric Weinstein, Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is kind of in his own category. Brett and Eric have done, like, they've launched their own podcast off the back of the success of the kind of IDW constellation, and probably helping their profile by being connected with many of those other people. So for me, the phrase IDW, it certainly stuck, and it certainly got taken up by a lot of people. So it certainly describes something, and working out what that something is, I think, is really helpful to kind of understand what does that word refer to. For me, I think the most helpful framing is that it named an emergent phenomenon.
Okay.
And that emergent phenomenon grew in the sort of in the shade of and in the cracks between the mainstream media. For example, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, talking about subjects and talking in a way that the mainstream media was not doing. And then Jordan Peterson coming along and talking about topics and perspectives that were not being reflected in the mainstream media, as we saw very kind of clearly with the Kathy Newman interview. Right. So there is I see it, and there's a thinker that was actually in the first big film that we put out called Glitch in the Matrix, and we've done quite a few interviews with since, called Jordan Greenhall, who talks about the blue church, and the blue church being the sort of the mainstream media, the deep state, basically all of the structures that were sort of grew in the wake of the Second World War. The blue church is a sort of, it's a way of thinking, it's received opinion, it's mainstream media, and that sort of mainstream versus the alternative was sort of, I'd say the naming of the IDW was the coming to consciousness of the alternative as a thing.
Right.
And as a thing that is equally powerful, or not equally powerful, but is significantly powerful relative to the mainstream media, and also reflected the fact that often there is a degree of groupthink in the mainstream media that hopefully the IDW was showing up, and I think at its best it does. Right.
Sorry. Well, I also realized I did leave out a probably important part of their definition. You covered the mainstream part of them, what they aren't, or they are a reaction to, but they're also a reaction to the sort of social justice aspect of society. So that's not necessarily, it depends on who you speak to. That's not necessarily mainstream. Some would say it is, but it's more fringe. It's just loud. So where does that part factor in?
Yeah, because I would say that it definitely coalesced around a reaction to the dominance of, because you've got to be very careful with your terminology here, because if you're talking about social justice, like, it's very easy to be framed of being against social justice itself. And I know that, for example, Brett and Eric, who I've probably done most with, would certainly say that they are supporters of social justice. They're supporters of all of the advances that have been made in society in terms of social justice since the 60s, but say that there is an upgrade to the left in particular that has shifted the terms of debate, and a lot of those words that sound very positive, like diversity, inclusion, equity, stroke equality, now actually mean something different. Right. And they're used in a very different way. They're used to silence people, and they're used to rule certain topics out of bounds, and that there has become a groupthink and a set of moral norms that you have to accept to be accepted into sort of polite society, that a lot of people, when I say polite society, I'd say the sort of the mainstream media conversation and the sort of liberal mainstream conversation that actually are not supported by the vast majority of people. Right. And that's definitely if we're naming this sort of the outlines of what the IDW is and this kind of emergent phenomena, it's also the coming to consciousness of a respectable version of that argument, because there's a lot of non-respectable versions of that argument. And I'd say a lot of the kind of the kind of what we call edgelord, shit posting, reaction to sort of social justice ideology that then resulted in the election of Trump is the sort of more or less respectable, and I don't think they would want to be respectable either, the less respectable version of that. So the IDW is a more respectable version of, hang on, there's something that's not being included in this, in the kind of more, in the liberal worldview, kind of naive liberal worldview that needs to be talked about. And certain topics around gender, for example, are not happening because of this ideology.
Right.
So that's what I'd say the IDW was. And also I'd say that there's a kind of paradox that in the naming of the IDW, it kind of died at that moment in a way, because it was no longer dark. It was because a lot of the initial criticism of the IDW were, how can you say that this is dark when Joe Rogan is the most powerful broadcaster who's ever lived, Sam Harris has that many millions of listeners? And there was a paradox. As soon as the New York Times article came out, I think it fundamentally shifted in quite a meaningful way, because it was no longer dark. Therefore, the dynamic changed. And in some sense, yeah, it's a kind of paradox. And in the naming of it, it kind of stopped being the thing that it was, or it became a kind of paradox of itself, I'd say.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but now that you say that, well, naming something, at least in like ancient traditions, I know, is sort of giving power to it in a way. So it kind of gave it the power, it took away the underdog in them. Maybe. Yeah. So, okay, because I'm trying to think of where, because we could continue on in what this one vein, because I do want to talk about, because you said what it was, and then I do want to talk about it now. But can we talk about, just for a quick tangent, about our mutual friend Ryan Bennett's idea of IDW protocol, which is the concept of it being a sort of like scientific method of free thinkers.
Yeah, I think Ryan's onto something there. So he's a programmer, so he was seeing it very much as, if the IDW is a network, how do you understand a network online? You understand it through, for example, the internet, you understand it through HTTP. I don't know what those words stand for. Right, there's protocol, the peace protocol, something hypertext protocol or something, I think. But basically, you understand the web by understanding how the computers communicate with each other, and what that becomes. That there's an emergent property of the individual computers that is called the internet. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't try and understand the internet by studying someone's hard drives.
Right.
So he's saying the idea of understanding what the IDW is by looking at the individual contents of each person's philosophy is the wrong idea. What actually we should be doing is saying, what are the principles that are underlying the IDW conversations? And he came up with three, which was, I think, one was, if you value ideas more than identity, you're in the IDW. Maybe we can bring them up on screen now. I can send you I've got the tweet that we can have a look at.
Yeah, let me look.
Just to give a bit of background for people. So Ryan was at one of the original, the Unconference. He was one of the organizers of the Unconference, which was when the Pangburn New York event in November last year didn't happen. Ryan took on basically organizing an event for all the people who'd already paid to be there, and that they called the Unconference. And what that kind of showed, which was also worth noting, is that the kind of people that are following the IDW conversations are quite an anti-fragile group of people. Like, when they realized that the conference wasn't going to happen, a group of them organized an event anyway in New York for people to come together and talk about the ideas. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there is something. I've said this before about Jordan Peterson, and I think it's true of the IDW, because there's quite a negative perspective on it in the culture. I think it selects for people who are prepared to be quite free thinking and disagreeable, because they're prepared to, like, if you're going off what a lot of the kind of mainstream media are telling you about someone, then you're probably not going to if you're more of a kind of herd thinker, you're not going to sort of follow that rabbit hole. But if you are more of a free thinker, you probably would do.
Right. Please go. Take it away, David.
Okay, so it's just opening up in, here we go. When you pursue truth instead of power, you're in the IDW. When you favor understanding over judgment, you're in the IDW.
Okay.
When you value ideas more than identity, you're in the IDW.
I see. There they are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are sort of
I
things. Say that again.
I think it's a really clever idea because even from the beginning, when the IDW was just considered to be this group of, 10 or 15 people, I think that was very limiting because there's clearly a groundswell of people who are interested in the ideas and want to have these conversations. We've done live events in London where one of the questions we've asked people, we've either shown a bit of a film or done a talk, and then the audience of say 80 people, we've kind of invited them to get into small groups with each other of like 6 to 8 people, and then ask them what topics do you feel that you're not allowed to discuss, or what opinions do you feel that you don't feel safe discussing in public. And that's a really like amazing thing for people to people feel a real sense of freedom and yeah, just a kind of sense of relief that they have a space to be able to talk about that.
Right.
We wouldn't necessarily say talk about that subject. It's like just what subjects do you feel that you can't talk about? And the way we do that is to say at the beginning, we ask for confidentiality. We say we're going to create a space now where we'd like you to raise your hand if you agree that you can talk about your experience, but not what anyone else shared. So we're kind of trying to create a safe space,
right?
Which is kind of ironic.
Safe space now.
Brett and Eric also say that, like that the IDW is an attempt to create a safe space for conversations, because bad faith in this environment, or someone who's prepared to use kind of identity as a weapon, or to kind of misquote you, or to kind of play to the crowd. The biggest issue I see in these debates on stage is playing to the crowd. Because that's kind of how this ideology wins, is by trying to get saying something that they think will get like virtue signaling on stage, and then the crowd kind of joins in, and that right. seems to be what derails on screen debate. Okay. And I guess there's lower stakes when you've got people together in a smaller group, but there's definitely just to loop back to where we started, there's definitely a wider phenomenon that is wanting to be born out of this sort of IDW conversation. And that's one that a lot of normies want to get involved in, like people who don't have millions of people following them on podcasts. And that's the thing that I think the IDW members have not done enough to
cultivate?
To kind of cultivate, thank you. Yeah, cultivate. Exactly. I think if at the beginning there was some kind of strategy for promoting more of a grassroots movement to discuss ideas, and there was an opportunity to do that, probably that opportunity was partly lost because of what happened with Pangburn. Like we're trying to do events now where we have high profile speakers, but then we also have a kind of more grassroots element as well going on, where people are able to speak themselves. And that there is a model that needs to be brought together. This is something again that Ryan's been working on with I don't know if you know about the app that he and a few friends have been putting together called what's it? It's like Speaking Together, or
I don't actually know the name of it. I was gonna maybe beta test it, and then I kind of forgot to to be like, hey, I do want to. But I know he's been working on that.
Yeah, so his idea for the app is that when you're going to an event, say a Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talk, you will sign up to the app, and then it will link you to other people who are going to the same talk, and then you would have a meal beforehand or a meal afterwards, and you'd have a talk about the ideas. Cool. And it would sort of which is really, and then you could use that could be attached to any debate, or event or talk that you would then sign up and be matched up with other people who are going.
Okay, and I can see that as the vision of what he's trying to promote with his IDW protocol. That he said, I remember him saying, like, I know I've lost for that being what it means, but I found it very interesting, and I think that now we're moving on to what it is now and maybe some critiques. So that is my biggest critique, is that I don't know that it was knowing or unknowing. I'm going to give the most charitable version of it. I think it was unknowing, unbeknownst to them, that they focused on themselves rather than on the ideas and, like you said, growing the grassroots of what they had started in a way. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, there was a definite trajectory to what happened. And I think you can't really overestimate what impact the sort of Pangburn implosion had, because even the on stage event seemed to have stopped.
Oh, right. I guess you're right. It is literally like how many events were canceled from him?
I think only a couple, but there was a sort of trajectory. So there were some events, for example, Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins, that were about quite significant things. Mm-hmm. There were significant points at issue in evolutionary biology, because that's the other side of the IDW, is that I know from the films that I've made with Eric in particular. For him, the IDW is just the media-facing arm of a much wider conversation that needs to happen. His perspective is that so many areas of human knowledge have become stuck at the same time, from physics, which has gone down a kind of a wrong turn with string theory, to evolutionary biology that has kind of got stuck as well, and that there's many other areas of human endeavor which have got stuck at the same time for much the same reasons, which is that we tend to, or structures that evolve around a certain view tend to then police themselves against outsiders who have heterodox opinions. So the idea of heterodox opinions being the thing that we desperately need in so many areas of the world and of academia right now is, if that's true, then surely there needs to be some strategy in terms of, okay, these are the people, these are the conversations that need to be had.
Right.
These are the like, I'm not seeing enough of that either from, like, if that's what the IDW is based around, I don't see too much thought given to, okay, what are those issues and what are the topics and what are the conversations that need to have. And we might see more of that from, for example, Eric's podcast.
Right.
That I know that he's got some. I haven't spoken to him for quite a while, but I know just listening to his podcast, he's got quite a few plans for where he wants to take it. So maybe that's his vision.
Right.
And maybe that's his vision more than anyone else in the IDW from the beginning, because only really. It's also true that pretty much, like, Joe Rogan seemed to back away from the whole idea of the intellectual dork web, as he called it, very soon after.
He thought it was lame.
Well, but yeah, he thought it was lame, and it kind of is for him. He's a fighter. He's a really cool guy, and he's kind of been lumped in with all these dorks suddenly. So it's like, oh, yeah, I'll be part of it because I like you, Eric, and that sounds cool. But maybe I'm not going to kind of go too hard on this. And he's got his own thing as well. Yeah,
he did. I feel like he's embodied the spirit of what, I don't know about everyone, but the spirit of what I initially thought it was, he has embodied, because he's free and open conversation with all sides. He goes to all of even including far left as well as far right.
Yeah.
Right?
It's paradoxical. I think that's a really good point, because Joe Rogan's definitely would never class himself as intellectual, but I think that he's far more true to because he knows what he doesn't know, and
he will receive criticism, right?
Yeah. You saw him, especially with the the interview he did with Jack Dorsey, and you saw him get a huge amount of criticism, and then on the next interview, I think it was with Sam Harris, you saw him thinking aloud of, wow, what did I do? I did something wrong. I got a load of criticism, and I never expected.
Agreed with them. Yeah.
Totally agree with him, and he also acknowledged that I just sit down and talk to people, and I've realized now with the people who are following me and the amount of traction I've got that my job's changing, and I now am being held to account in a different way. And he took that on board, and he did another interview with Jack Dorsey where he invited Tim Pool in, and that's categorically different. I've been critical of Dave Rubin quite a bit. I did an interview with him that was quite where I was quite strong and fair, I think, because I think Dave Rubin doesn't do that. I think Dave Rubin is narrative driven. It's kind of ironic because part of Eric's criticism of the need for the IDW is the fact that the mainstream media has become narrative driven.
Yeah.
Dave Rubin is hugely narrative driven. He's only really interested in the flaws of the left and frames everything within that, and also frames quite extreme figures as being much more mainstream than they are by not challenging them and actually kind of being kind of dishonest about their real views and their real perspectives. But the thing with Dave Rubin, and I'm going to sort of speak openly about it because I think that's the values of what the IDW is. Dave Rubin is very, very thin-skinned and cannot handle criticism, and that makes him far more. I mean, he's not an intellectual either, but it makes him much more dumb than he needs to be because he can't take criticism, and he sees anyone criticizing him as being a personal attack, and that's really, really dangerous. I think it's actually very, very dangerous because the more he frames anyone who criticizes him as being bad faith, the more that enhances the division, the more that creates the kind of polarization that, at its best, the IDW is about kind of moving beyond. But I think the way that I see Rubin can't take criticism, and then anyone who criticizes him, he frames as a bad person, and that's really dangerous because it just continues the dynamic of these people are bad and these people are good, which is, I think, at the root of a lot of the division, a lot of the polarization that we're seeing
on all sides. And that's something that he's, I suppose, the most guilty of it. But because I have, like, on Twitter, I kind of, not on purpose, have ended up coming in a space that's very pro IDW and quite critical of IDW people. And by IDW I mean those particular people. That's the way that it's come to mean from people who speak about it online. From what I've seen is, like, when they say the IDW, they're specifically meaning those particular individuals that are part of it. And like I'm not part of it in their eyes. You know what I mean? Like, those who are participating in the conversation aren't part of it. You know, according to Ryan Bennett, we can all be part of it, you know, in his IDW protocol. But from how, I don't know about how they think of it now, those who are part of the media front-facing part of it. But at least those who speak about it, they see it as those individuals. Anyway, so oh man, where I was going somewhere. So with this, so the critiques I see are not received by any of those prominent members. I've not seen anyone, like, I've talked about critique actually, like, once, and like Brett retweeted it and was like, yes, anyone who wants to critique you in good faith, that's your greatest ally, or something like that. Yeah, he agreed with me or something. I think I said that they're your greatest ally, and I used ally before I realized what comes along with that. But anyway, but I meant, like, if someone is your friend and they're critiquing you, that's a help, not a hindrance. And then he retweeted it like, yeah, this is great, or something like that. I don't want to pretend that he didn't say that specifically, but he said something along the lines of agreeing with it. But then I've never seen I don't want to say never, but I haven't seen personally a lot, other than through maybe Joe Rogan. Maybe Jordan Peterson has been willing to hear out criticisms. But I haven't seen them be like, critique, great. And I say critique because that's the kind version of criticism, right? Like the good faith version. I haven't seen that being like, you know what? That's maybe something we can work on. Like, other than Joe Rogan specifically being very open about.
Yeah.
So, you know, like, what have you seen of that?
It's a really interesting question. There's lots of interesting points in there. I think there's something that Brett says, which is bad faith changes everything, which is very true. Because I see some of the criticisms do seem to be motivated by bad faith. But I'd love to hear a bigger discussion of this term bad faith. What does it mean? Because
Dave Rubin says that it's just everyone who disagrees with him. Like, that's what it is to him.
So let's put Rubin to one side. I just want to cap off the piece about Rubin by saying why I think he's very significant. Firstly, because he was so important in the initial constellation of the IDW. Lots of the main really fascinating conversations happened on his podcast in early 2018.
Right. And
he identified himself very clearly with the IDW and has continued to identify himself with the IDW. So I think it is fair to focus on him. Mm-hmm. And there have been other critiques, like Kathy Young wrote a piece about the dangers of tribalism in the IDW that had like 3 paragraphs about Dave, and he just really kind of let rip at her on Twitter. So it's happened quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But let's move away. I don't want to feel that I'm focusing like unfairly on Rubin. I think I've said very clearly what I feel about him. And people watch my interview with him if you want to see kind of me putting those criticisms to him directly.
Right. Which you were very fair with, by the way.
I think so. Yeah. I think so. And then Sam Harris and Eric had a really interesting conversation. I think it was one of Sam Harris's town hall meetings where Eric was in the audience, then he got up on stage, and they talked for quite a while about the criticism that they were getting and how they felt that the bad quality criticism that they were both getting was making them both worse at their jobs, because it meant that they were almost certainly negating good criticism because they were just so inundated with bad criticism that they were basically now treating everything as if it was bad criticism.
Okay.
And that they were so unused or had experienced so little good faith criticism for such a long time that they didn't really know what it looked like anymore.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard that. So that's really very interesting.
Yeah. It was a town hall that Sam gave a while ago, and I think it was a really interesting digression, a really interesting discussion. And I think that's almost certainly true once you get to that sort of level of that number of followers on Twitter and that number of kind of that level of kind of cultural impact. It's very difficult to take in criticism. Mm-hmm. But this question of what is bad faith criticism, I think, is a really interesting one to pull apart, because what does it mean to say that something's in bad faith? And how do you know that something's in bad faith? Because it's very easy for all of us to say, oh, no, I'm not responding to that. That's in bad faith. If it feels like something's motivated by resentment. Like there's one critic that I have that kind of pursues me everywhere, that I feel he's motivated mainly by resentment. Mm-hmm. I kind of know what he thinks, and I don't want to engage with him. I only have one. I'm sure that Sam and Eric and the other guys have a huge number of critics who they feel are motivated by bad faith. But given the fact that almost nobody thinks they're motivated by bad faith, and if you have a disagreement with someone, no one's going to come to you like in a year's time and say, you know what, I was actually motivated by bad faith when I was criticizing you before. So what does the word mean? How do we define it? How can we measure it? Because otherwise, I see the word bad faith being used by people in the sort of center IDW space, being used in the same way that no platforming is used by people on the kind of intersectional left. Oh, shouldn't talk to that person. They shouldn't have a platform. The word bad faith is one that has to be kind of, I think, teased apart and explained, and we need to kind of understand what we mean by that. I do recognize that there are times on some sort of very left-leaning YouTube shows, for example, where you get the feeling that the person is playing to the gallery. I think playing to the gallery and virtue signaling is probably a good definition of bad faith.
Right.
But we need to unpack it because, and then I think we have to go into psychological realms to understand what that means. I would love to have that discussion with Eric or with Brett to see how do you know when something's bad faith and how do you define it, because otherwise it just becomes a kind of catch-all way of avoiding engaging with a lot of people.
Right. And I'm sure at the level that they are at with the number of social media followers and whatnot, it's probably, it's definitely, I have no idea because I'm not there. You know, I don't know what it's like. I'm sure it would be very difficult to filter out these things. And I mean, I'd say the best faith you could find is your own friends. You know what I mean? And I mean, if you're there in it, I don't know that they can properly critique each other, but I don't know. There's some people, like, I don't know, maybe you're one of them who could, like, you know, give a message for us who see some of these things. And that's the funny thing. The critique I have is that they don't take critiques. So yes. What do I do with that? What do you do with that? What do they do with that? You know, and they spoke about it, you said, like Sam and Eric.
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful to know what those critiques are, I guess. I do think that there are some high quality critics out there that are probably not being engaged with at the moment. I think that the sort of constellation that seems to be around Arc Digital seems good to me.
Okay.
That, like, Arc Digital, from what I've seen, seems to be a sort of Quillette. Like Quillette, I really rate Quillette, and I rate a lot of stuff that they do, but Arc seems to have like a genuine ideological spectrum there.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Like they have Kathy Young, but they also have Jesse Single. They have I think, has Matt Jameson written for them in the past as well?
He's a columnist for them now.
Yeah, I mean he's obviously quite a sort of strident critic of the IDW online.
Yeah. Well, I've had him on my channel before. Yeah, and he's given me the rundown of why he gets a little conspiracy theorist-ish in some spots, but some real stuff that you're like, oh, okay, you frame it in an angry way, but there was some meat to it that he gave.
Yeah, I think the issue, like, there's been a very sort of, there's been a lot of discussion about various people. The one that I'm thinking of in particular is Sam Cedar, and there does seem to be, when I watch Sam Cedar and then also Michael Brooks, who is a really strong critic of Dave Rubin.
Yeah,
there is an element of ridicule and playing to the gallery, and this is part of the problem in this online world, is that you get far more credit by giving your fans, giving sort of, for them, their left-wing audience, the red meat. They want to see people dunking on Dave Rubin. They want to see them kind of giving. So what you find that everything starts to polarize more and more, because the incentives drive people further and further into ridicule, into sort of fairly binary thinking, into tribalism, because tribalism is where most people are.
Yeah.
I mean, we're trying to create a YouTube channel around nuance and different perspectives, and it's not that easy. Like, it's much easier to give people. There's a reason why Dave Rubin has ended up giving people anti-SJW like everything he does is constantly kind of anti-SJW content. That's where the views are.
Yeah.
That's where the views are. That's where your audience is. That's where, especially when you've got, like, you're subsidizing yourself on on something like Patreon, which he no longer is because he's now gone over to the Blaze. But when he was on Patreon, your biggest supporters, the people who are giving you the most money and you're having dialogues with, are pushing you more and more towards more extreme content.
Well, one thing I was very impressed with Sam Seder is that he was on Tim Pool's channel.
Yeah.
And when they discussed about the I don't want to say pros and cons, but the different perspectives of Trump's impeachment. And I was very taken aback that Sam even said yes to that. So I watched it, and it was good. Like, I mean, you could see like lots of eyes rolling on Sam's behalf. But like I give them both kudos to, like, okay, you guys, good for you, because that was what people are calling for. The critiques that I'm seeing of the IDW. And I think that Tim Pool is kind of like in the IDW from where he sits. So I thought that was like a step in the right direction. I haven't seen anything since then, though. So, but I thought that was, what did you think of that?
I haven't seen that interview with Sam Seder and Tim Pool.
Well, even hearing that they have talked, like, do you think that that's like, oh, there's hope, or does it change things at all?
Yeah, I don't know. I would be interested. I don't know. I mean,
okay, well, tell me why, because I thought it was great.
Thinking in the recent Sam Harris podcast with Eric, they both talk about Sam Seder quite a lot, and then Sam Seder made a whole piece about them. He said really unfair because they said that some of their critics are displaying kind of psychopathic behavior. They didn't necessarily say Sam was doing that, but they kind of hinted at it, and Sam kind of was very upset, as you kind of might imagine.
Yeah, shoot.
But I don't know. I wonder whether what would be the downside of someone like Eric going on talking to Sam Seder and calling, if there is bad faith, calling it out and letting the audience make their mind up. I mean, maybe I'm naive here, but why block someone and not talk to them? Why not talk to Sam Seder, and then if he's displaying bad faith tactics during it, call them out and let the audience make up their own minds?
Right.
Is that so ridiculous?
Well, and I think, and I watched recently the episode you had with David Pakman, and I thought, and so kind of in a similar way with Tim having Sam on his show, I kind of thought that was like a similar sort of feel for you. And I mean, that interview went great. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Right? Like I feel like you're so we're seeing some people, not the core necessarily, but some people making those.
Well, David Pakman has been on Joe Rogan and been on Sam Harris now, or I think actually no, Sam was on David Pakman's show.
Oh, he was? Okay, so that's some reaching across.
David Pakman, of all of the sort of left wing, the sort of regular left wing hosts, to me seems like the most genuinely good faith. Like, I've seen him regularly take positions that have upset his own audience.
Oh, right.
And that for me, I think, is there's another couple of interviews that I'd highly recommend for people if they haven't seen them, with Daniel Schmachtenberger, that I did, called War on Sense Making, and then War on Sense Making 2. And in that we talked about how you have to be prepared to take a position that's going to make you disliked by your own tribe, to think clearly. That's the kind of, and he describes it as the valley crossing that needs to happen. That's kind of term from evolutionary biology. Right. That we need to go through. We all have to find our own perspectives. We all have to go through this process of kind of leaving our own tribe, going off into the wilderness, and then not joining another tribe, which is what happened with Dave Rubin, is that he did go through the process, but then joined another tribe and is now kind of saying everything that's going to make him loved by that tribe, and not finding kind of a nuanced perspective in the middle, or a kind of so yeah, I think that's what I see David Pakman doing, is having those conversations or taking those positions that is going to get him some pushback from his own side.
Right.
And that's, yeah, I'm not seeing that so much from some of the other figures on the sort of left
right.
tube.
Well, I'd left space. Tube, yeah. I would like to speak to Michael Brooks because
or on the right as well. So
right.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. Or on the right as well. Like that's everywhere. That's right. The dynamics that's the dynamics of online. Full stop.
Of course, yes. For the tribalism. Well, I feel like we kind of I focus on the left because that's I'm not even concerned. That's one of the critiques of the IDW, I feel like, also, because they're like, oh, you're not critiquing the right. But I get why they're focusing on the left, because they're like, I'm not even concerned about, at least for some of them, I'm not concerned with the right. Like, that's not where I am. And, like, for me, I'm center left. So I want to focus on where I sit, because that's where I am. Yeah. Right? But yeah, I do want to speak with Michael Brooks because for some reason we follow each other on Twitter. So I'm like, oh, I can message him. I would love to talk to any of them, but I need to be able to get in a DM because, otherwise how will you communicate? So I'd like to talk with him. I think he's coming out with a book against the IDW. I don't remember what it's called, but
it's called Against the Web.
Oh, okay. Well, literally. Yeah, and they find it dangerous because I think they're seeing it as a gateway to the alt-right, and I want to see why. And that's another thing what reasons why I want to talk with any of them, really, but with Michael, because he does make fun of Dave, and I've laughed, because it's funny. But he definitely represents something that I think we need to understand. Why do they think that way? Why do they see people, members of what seems like it should be their own left side, like why are they seeing these people as grifters? Why are they seeing these people as going against them when they still? I think that Yuri Harris wrote a piece about why the IDW is not left, even though they sit left in most of their positions. But that is something that I continue to not really understand. I know Yuri explained it in Quillette. I still don't really get it. So I want to talk. I think that it's important to hear, because when they're talking to someone who is not 100% in their camp, who, okay, so if they're talking to me, knowing where I sit, or maybe knowing where you sit, they're not going to just be ripping it apart like they're in their own tribe, right? They'll be a little bit more charitable, like we all are, with people who are like, oh, I don't want them to be completely alienated in this conversation, so I'll try to be charitable. So but I want to hear in their own words why they think the way they think. Because actually, I'm doing a letter with Liam Bright. He's a philosopher of science, but he also is a critical race theorist. So on the letter.wiki, I'm doing a back and forth with him about critical race theory. Because I'm like, oh, I totally have him in good, like he and I have good faith with each other. We're friends. I've interviewed him on my show, and we're very friendly with one another, but I am like, critical race theory, really? I don't get that, at least how you can hold it in a good light, so I want to understand why he sees it the way he does, and why so many other people I respect do not. And I feel like we're missing that. Do you feel like our that's why the IDW, I think, has a lot of critiques and criticism, and because for some reason, they're not connecting in a way that people are like, oh, they're so curious to understand the other side, or why they're being disagreed with. Like, what do you see in that?
Yeah, I think that's been my criticism as well, my critique as well, is that I don't see enough reaching out to have those dialogues, and a lot of the time it seems to have kind of gone a bit weird. There was a recent incident between Eric and Billy Bragg. So Billy Bragg is a kind of old school left wing protest singer in the UK, and somehow had watched one of Eric's interviews, I think on Rebel Wisdom, and then took from that Eric was saying that he wasn't going to sit down with people on the left to have discussions with. And I think that was a misreading of what Eric meant or Eric said, but their interaction on Twitter kind of degenerated very, very quickly, and that could have been a really good dialogue. I think Michael Brooks could be a good person to dialogue with. He's certainly very, very bright. He's very well read as well in quite a lot of the stuff we've been featuring on the channel. Ken Wilber and integral theory is something that I think is really, really valuable to understand what's going on culturally. Okay. So we did a piece with Ken called Jordan Peterson and the Evolution of Culture, and he describes different value systems being online at the same time, and postmodernism being what he calls a green value system, and the previous value system was based around science and rationality and was sort of a modernist system, which he calls orange.
Okay, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, really useful map. There's a very short ebook that Ken Wilber released after the election of Trump called Trump in a Post-Truth World. Okay. It's about 87 pages. It's really well put together. He just says this is what's going on right now. Green, which was the sort of the postmodern worldview that first started coming through in the 60s, is now becoming is starting to break down, and we're getting all of these sort of weird outcomes of postmodernism, and it's basically where green has gone septic and has become dysfunctional. And this is what I think the IDW is reacting against, as the excesses of postmodernism, the excesses of relativism, of the idea that there's no such thing as truth, all of these things kind of, or truth is just what anyone says it is in culture, and it's saying no, that way lies chaos. And I agree with that. That's something that there has to be a sort of, the transcendent value of truth is something that we do need to return to, but it's not anyone's particular perspective. There have to be multiple perspectives in that. So there's an integration that needs to happen. And what I see the IDW doing too often is only reacting to that sort of the bad side of postmodernism and not pushing forward to a new synthesis on the other side, which is something that Will talks about. He says there's a new value system coming online, or a new development in consciousness called integral, which goes beyond the color scheme, but then integrates all the previous levels. You see that there's a value in traditionalism that we shouldn't get rid of. We see there's a value in postmodernism, which is introducing more perspectives that we need to include as well. And right now what we're seeing is, and the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson perfectly illustrates this, is we've lost so many of the traditional values, and that's really toxic to our culture because we're based on a lot of these traditional values. So we need a form of integration that integrates traditionalism, it integrates postmodernism, it integrates all of these different value systems, and I think that can be done. I think that that's possible if we're not stuck in reacting against traditionalism reacting against modernism, or modernism reacting against traditionalism, or postmodernism reacting against all of them. I do think there is a perspective beyond them, and I think that's what, at its best, the IDW can point towards. At its worst, it just starts to be, oh, look, the left has gone crazy and everything's going to, postmodernism is the source of all evil, and then it's
its own tribe, right? Like it's becoming its own tribe?
Yeah, it can become its own tribe, and the unifying aspect of that tribe is the reaction against the excesses of green postmodern culture, which need to be reacted against. But it can't stay there. Otherwise, right. it's just purely reactionary.
That was good. It is a reactionary movement.
Definitely read that ebook.
Yes.
It's really... So a lot of people have talked about Integral. So Integral had a real moment probably in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it's become less influential since. but it's a really, really useful map.
Okay.
And it's a lot of, we've had the conversation on our channel before that the integral OS is a really useful OS if you to run. You forget about it after you've learned it, because you can get trapped in all of their terminology and it becomes a very insular world far too easily, partly because it's such a good map. Okay. But it's a really, really useful map to understand the world with and what's going on now and why we're in a sort of why we're in the cultural position we're in.
And I honestly feel like you're in what Rebel Wisdom is doing is sort of what I think I initially believed the IDW was doing. Like you've kind of like taken up the original, oh, let's look into, I don't even know, maybe that's actually wrong. What it is something's happening, things are shifting, and here's some bits to explain what's happening and maybe give a voice to those who don't. And you, where Rebel Wisdom is you guys are like, okay, let's I feel like you're not necessarily looking to give a voice to the voiceless the way that the IDW I think would say that they started off as. I feel like you're like looking at a sort of what's happening. Why is this happening? Let's look at the cultural context underneath. And you kind of have, does that sound like correct or similar to what you see yourselves as? I am just giving random ideas here. So
yeah, I'm a journalist. I worked in the newsroom at Channel 4 News for about 10 years. I've made documentaries for the BBC and for Channel 4. I have a strong background in the sort of, I know how the mainstream media works, and I know how the mainstream media thinks, and what I'm trying to do with Rebel Wisdom is to put out a perspective that I don't see covered in the mainstream media.
Right.
Partly because there's just not enough depth, and I think we're really trying to look at what are the deeper factors at work behind or under the surface of culture. So yes. Some of the thinkers that we've had on, like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jordan Greenhall, Jamie Wheel, they're really trying to enunciate, okay, what if we're going through, and it feels like we're going through a massive shift, what are the philosophical ramifications of that? What are the perspectives that are not being seen? What are the dangers in the present moment, and where do we need to go? And also there is a cultural piece that I see certain perspectives being like there is a groupthink in the mainstream media that I think excludes a lot that should be included. So we also cover that on the channel. So we do have a bias towards those kind of perspectives on, for example, gender. We had one of our biggest hits last year was Heather Hying talking about toxic femininity, for example. But it's very easy. But we don't want to be clickbait around that topic. That got about 160,000 views. If we wanted to kind of continue to put out, continue to mine that's a very. If we wanted to do clickbait around that, we could do, and we definitely don't want to do that. We want to move the conversation forward and to put those perspectives out there that are not being reflected, but also to do it with integrity and to do it with a sense of where the cutting edge of the conversation is and where it needs to move towards. And also, okay, we'll put out perspectives that are not being reflected in the mainstream conversation, but also you don't want to just react. You don't want to just put out the other side of things. You want to see what's the perspective beyond that. Right. So, for example, on gender, we did a whole series called Men and Women After Me Too, where the framing is if the conversation in the culture looks like a dysfunctional relationship between men and women, and I think in many ways it does, and has done. What does a healthy relationship look like? It has to be like, from any relationship counsel will tell you, both partners need to have a voice, need to speak. And I think that at the time Me Too happened, there was this sense of, men, now is not your time to speak, now is your time to listen. And I agree with that. I think Me Too was a really essential moment in many areas, and it called out a lot of bad behavior and from a lot of who've been behaving badly for a very long time, and that needed to happen. And we need both perspectives in the conversation. We need to have the conversation around different levels of harassment or bad behavior. We need to get a sense of proportion. We need all of these conversations to happen, and they can't be shut down by saying, no, only one party in this conversation can speak. Right. For example, that's one example, but that's the perspective I think we're trying to bring.
Right. Yeah, and it also seems like, and I don't know that you're doing it purposely, but like trying to only focus on this, but it seems like you're really focusing like the depth thing, the idea that you are trying to look at the meaning crisis, sort of, that Jordan Peterson touches on in his space.
Yes.
You guys are really having a lot of guests on who speak to more than the scientific. So,
yes. So
can you? And yeah, I suppose the mainstream media isn't covering that, so that could be because of that. But I also want to know if there's any other reasonings in what goes behind choosing these particular individuals to be on your show.
Yeah. I mean, John Vervaeke, for example, we've had on a few times, who's also a professor of psychology in Toronto alongside Jordan Peterson. And his focus is mostly on, he does a course called Buddhism and Cognitive Science. And he's very much focused on what is wisdom. Can we understand how wisdom is created? It's more than just sort of propositional or intellectual content. It's also about embodiment. It's also about practice. So we've got a big focus on that. And yeah, it's mainly around the meaning crisis and the sense that we are potentially in a kind of more than once in a generation. It could be sort of once in a millennium kind of shift. That's the kind of shift that we're going through at the moment, where all of the previous ways of understanding the world and our sort of ways of making sense of the world are all falling away at the same time. The mainstream media is in crisis, academia is in crisis, so many things are in crisis at the same time. And the other perspective is, certainly when I was working in the media, the sort of new atheist perspective, the sort of scientific rationalist atheist perspective was kind of hegemonic in the mainstream media. And I think it probably is still to a degree, but I think it's starting to shift. Like the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson was like, hey, we've thrown the baby out of the bathwater here with getting rid of saying that all religion is nonsense. And so now I think there is a potential for a conscious integration of the wisdom traditions, like the world's oldest wisdom traditions, and are moving away from this incredibly scientifically arrogant perspective that in some ways we were more intelligent than every other human society that's ever lived, and we've invented science, so we understand everything. And we've realized that perspective is barren and arid.
There's something called the Tower of Babel, I believe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but it's a perspective that doesn't include all the most important things of being human, and we're seeing the results of that around us everywhere.
Right.
The opiate crisis, to the depression crisis, to like it's not a way that we can live. So something that's the deeper inquiry I think of a lot of people on the channel is something needs to go in the place of religion.
Right.
What we lost when we lost religion has never really been replaced, and somehow we need to put something else in that place. John Vervaeke thinks that whatever that is, it can't look like anything from the past because we've destroyed we've so destroyed the underlying mythological and psychological worldview that gave birth to those religious narratives that it will look completely different. But that's the deeper inquiry, I think. Like, how do we solve the meaning crisis? What goes in that space? And that's an open question.
That is, yeah. I'm trying to find people's perspectives on that, because I very much am like, don't know what you're gonna put in. Who's gonna make a new religion here, guys? Well, and that's it.
Yeah.
Circling back to the IDW, there are a couple different perspectives within there. Like, I know Sam Harris thinks that you can put science in as the ideal with some meditation. Like,
yes.
And I don't want to represent him in the sense that maybe he sees meditation as that's the spiritual part, but the science is the thinking, cognitive part. And I know Brett Weinstein has said we need to replace religion with something, and been very vague about what.
Yes.
Just not Jesus, according to the past, like, little Twitter thing. Although he did sort of say, "Oh, I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into."
Yeah.
So there is, I guess, for context, for those of you who are on Twitter, he was talking about how he made a plea to Christians to sort of do away with our hocus pocus part of our religion, the magic. I think he said magic, which lots of us. Sorry, I am a Christian, so that's why, like, I'm saying us. You could say mysteries, and I think it wouldn't have been as upsetting, because there's mysteries in science too, right? But I think because he used the word magic, it was like, oh, okay, we're these heathens with our magical practices, but whatever.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting thing that happened over Twitter, though. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of pile-ons, but just seeing what was this sort of back and forth, and, like, you can't actually take away, for people who have an existing religion and who exist within a framework, you can't take away these core elements, kind of like what you're saying about the baby out with the bathwater. Well, little baby Jesus is our baby. Like, right? So I don't know about I do want to speak with John Vervaeke at some point, but these frameworks are so ancient within our human psyche, and you can't just throw it out. And so I don't know how we're going to come up with something new when that little suggestion over Twitter sent many a people in a tailspin, right? So that's why I'm like, I don't know what we're going to do with that.
Well, there's other people who've been on the channel, like Jonathan Pajot and Paul Vanderklay, who are very much focused on how do we renew Christianity. Like, that's their solution is, and I'm open-minded about that. I feel like it feels unlikely to me that Christianity will fill that place.
Why do you say that?
Because I just think that it's had its time, and I think that what we're seeing, even with Jordan Peterson, is a kind of integration of Christianity that's a kind of post-Christian perspective.
I
like,
agree
it's consciously
with that.
Yeah, it's not explaining Christianity away, but it is explaining a lot of it in a much more that's what I find really difficult about being around Christians. And I had this at I went to Paul Vanderklay's service.
Okay,
and
I've
had
spoken
this
with Paul.
Yeah,
he's got an interesting way of.
Yeah,
he gets it. He's not like, what do you mean? Like, he gets what we're talking about.
Yeah, but I had that experience at his church where I was asked by someone whether I was a Christian, and I kind of went on this long discussion of that I appreciate it far more. I was actually brought up as a Methodist, but I appreciate. So I had a religious upbringing, and and I appreciate Christianity far more, mainly through listening to Jordan Peterson and kind of understanding the depth and the intelligence, like the profound nature of a lot of Christian thought. But I understand that sort of consciously, and that's what I find when I talk to a lot of Christians, is that they talk in metaphor, and I'm like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? What does that mean? And it's like, but there is something very helpful about religion in that you can understand it at so many different levels. You don't need to, like, different segments of the population understand different parts of it, but it works on those multiple levels for different people. So there is something, like, I see both sides. I have a skepticism that Christianity could be renewed, because I think its time has probably passed. But at the same time, I recognize the challenge of putting something in that place when what was in that place was so deeply woven and I think whatever comes afterwards probably needs to integrate that tradition rather than replace it, certainly.
Okay. Yes. I mean, I've studied the Christian history, like, for my degree, and it's it was the government, basically. You know, like Christendom. It's definitely not Christendom anymore, but yeah, I know what you mean about what Jordan Peterson did in sort of integrating it with stuff that we can understand as modern people. So I definitely can see, and well, that's why he also, I think, connected with so many people, his message, and he is seen as a sort of messianic figure. Yeah. I mean, look at the poster for his documentary. Like, when that first came out, that stained glass image, maybe I'll probably put it up when I actually edit this here. I was a little disturbed at first, because I was like, whoa, I mean, dude's not Jesus here, people. But, like, he has a sort of John the Baptist feel of crying
he certainly
in the
has
wilderness.
Sort of, yeah, it's the prophet. He's certainly doing the prophet archetype. Right.
If we're gonna go into his own favorite, sort of perspectives of archetypes, which I love archetypes. Anyways, he actually brought Jung to a number of people who were like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing. Or whatever. Like, he's definitely renewed that sort of look at that perspective of life, like what we were saying about how there's more to life than science. And I think that it's sort of bringing an awareness to that meaning crisis as to, well, if you're not this popular just on a chance, like you're speaking into someone's life, you're speaking into people's lives. But anyways, I'm seeing the time, and I know you gotta like pack for like leaving here to go to India for however long, so I don't want to keep you. Is there anything?
Was there one last question?
Like, do I have one last question, or do you have one last thing you wanted to say?
Were you about to say that?
No, I think, I don't think that's right. I don't think I have anything else, unless there's something that you wanted to mention that I missed.
I don't think so. I'd be interested to hear any kind of responses to this. What was I thinking when you were talking before? There was something. Oh yeah, just that I did an interview with Patricia, who made that film about Jordan, and she talks about the poster in that as well.
Oh, okay. So I haven't seen it yet. I should. What does she say about it? Should I just watch it, or?
She talks about what all the figures in the poster represent. Like, each of the figures to the side of Jordan represent a part of the story, which was really quite interesting. And if you look at the poster, there's a lot of hidden meanings in the poster that are worth having a look at. Oh,
just like Jordan Peterson, lots of hidden meanings.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's good. I think that we were pretty fair, like, in looking at the IDW and the history. If any of you guys are watching this, let us know if you thought we were unfair or not. But I think that, we kind of got to the heart of what I've been trying to to seek and gather about this phenomenon. So, yeah, thanks
Yes.
for chatting here, David. We'll see how things go in the next few years here.
Yeah. Yeah. Good to speak to you, Andrea.